Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Wallace, and in this video for the Faculty of Arts at Home series, I'm going to talk about the research that I've been doing alongside a number of other colleagues in the Department of Film and Television Studies, including Charlotte Brunsdon, John Burrows, Michael Piggott and Claire Jesson, into the history of cinema projection in the UK as part of the AHRC funded Projection project. Now, although the weight of the project was towards historical concerns and using oral history interviews and archival resources to chronicle the changing labour of cinema projectionists since the late 1800s, what I'd like to focus on here is the central role of digitalisation to both the histories that we were chronicling and to the overall conceptualisation of the project and its outputs. In part, the project began to take shape around the start of the last decade as a result of the projection team's mutual frustrations with the number of cancelled film shows we were encountering at local cinemas. This, we recognised, was the result of a process of digitalisation within cinema, in which analogue 35mm film projectors were being replaced with digital systems, with the concomitant redundancy of the majority of those projectionists who were still working in the UK. By the end of 2011, when the project was being formulated, about 70% of all cinema screens in the UK had been converted to digital. Now, these teething problems proved to be just that, but in combination, they overturned a long-standing adage of the cinema projectionists dating back at least to the 1940s that, to quote Mike Williams, one of the projectionists that I interviewed for the project, "In the perfect show, in the perfect cinema, the audience shouldn't be aware that there's a projectionist showing the film. If he's doing his job properly, they don't even know he exists." Ironically, the job of the projectionist was suddenly being made visible, that mediation between the machine and the audience was being made visible because of the failure of their digital replacements. The project then was an attempt to capture the labour of the figure that had been central to the workings of cinema across the globe since the 1890s, but whose work had remained largely invisible because the various institutions of mainstream cinema had been formulated and formalised around the occlusion of the labour involved in production processes in favour of a kind of seamless entertainment experience, and the exhibition of films was no exception. What we found was that in various formulations, driven by a complex network of factors including technological developments, regulation and legislation, wartime labour patterns, employment conditions, and broader social, cultural and economic aspects, the invisible projectionists were, kind of like the legs of the metaphorical swan, paddling exceedingly hard in order to give the impression of their own non-existence. However, that's not to say that the nature of the job was consistent, and to a great extent the history that we uncovered was one of continued strife in the face of poor employment conditions and technological change designed to either fill gaps in a labour market, in the 1950s for example, or to mitigate against human error, or the rogue projectionists trying to improve a film, by live mixing sound levels or speeding up and slowing down sequences during the silent era to provide what they perceived to be a better performance. So, of course, one that was different to what the filmmakers had envisioned. And if you want an example of this, Warren Beatty, you can do a Google search. Warren Beatty gives a really interesting example of the London premiere of Bonnie and Clyde, where a projectionist did just this with the sound effects. Rather than seeing the arrival of digital as a unique technological transition, our research suggests that actually it could be equally seen as the latest transition in a longer history of change that had seen projection boxes in the UK shift from a series of team-based working processes, which in the 1940s it was not uncommon for between 3 and 5 projectionists to be employed to work and attend to a single screen at any one time, to the multiplex boxes of the 1990s and the early 2000s, screens, where a single projectionist would be responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of all of the screens in the building, aided by automated systems and long-running self-rewinding projection equipment. Digital projection can be thought of somewhat differently in that, to a great extent, it's the final process in this long history of the projectionist to some effectively being kind of evolved out of the projection process. But it is nonetheless part of that much longer history of change, technological change, which directly affected, the working practices of the working projectionist. In many ways, then, this project had something of a melancholic undertone to it, of course. Digital projection was bringing an end to a 120-year-old vocation, and with it the attendant knowledge of what being a cinema projectionist entailed and meant. The mass redundancies were, of course, the most significant aspect of this, but we also saw how this change spoke to a broader loss in terms of the aesthetic, intuitive and human elements of projection that had characterised much cinema going in the pre-digital age. The details of cinema presentation, as it was known, this was the name given to the kind of mood work conducted by the projectionist. For example, how, when and in what order to lower the auditorium lights, to open the curtains, to start the projection and fade in the sound, demonstrated that perhaps the projectionist had not been quite as invisible a part of the cinema-going experience as we'd thought. The cancelled shows in the early days of digital suggested that the absence of a person knowledgeable in the art and technology of cinema projection was a fundamental one. It wasn't just the work that was being replaced, but an aesthetic sensibility for how a film screening should be orchestrated. And it's a common complaint, I think, of digital cinemas, actually, still, that the lights come on too harshly and too quickly at the end of the film, almost as soon as the credits start to roll, because the instinct to evacuate the screen as quickly as possible is not overridden by a human person whose job it is to make sure the experience is as good as it can be and can be maintained to its very end. Now, this makes it sound, I think, as though the digital revolution has been catastrophic to the experience of cinema going. But perhaps the biggest surprise to come from our research was that whilst bemoaning the human cost of the transition to digital, in terms of the quality of the projected film, there was almost unanimous preference within the projectionists we interviewed for the digital film file over the 35mm celluloid print that it had replaced. Unlike celluloid, the digital image doesn't degrade in the same way as celluloid, so the 1000th screening is theoretically the same as the first. This was fundamentally not true of 35mm film prints, which would pick up imperfections from dust, dirt and scratches with every screening, in spite of the projectionists' best efforts in their kind of war on dust. One projectionist, Peter Howden, who was a projectionist at the Rio Cinema, it died in London, even made the case that the perfect image that digital projectionists that digital represented actually made it easier for the projectionist to remain invisible. Digital, of course, has many other advantages. It's portable in a way that most 35mm film projectors are not. And over the last decade or so, this has seen the move of mainstream cinema out of purpose-built venues and into a range of public spaces. Not just art galleries, but city centres, town squares, castles, heritage venues, forests. In a not unrelated occurrence, the provision of access offered by digital television platforms has also, to some extent, facilitated a way through which some studios, film production studios, have been able to mitigate against the devastating impact on the worldwide arts sector of COVID by releasing new films for streaming. And of course, there's been, in a way, a resurgence in the drive-in film experience, a socially distant way of screening films using digital projection technologies mostly. It's also provided some opportunities for us as a project. One of the key outputs of the projection project was the Cinema Projectionist, a website, archive and virtual projection box in which key resources collected during the research, including analogue photos, digitally scanned and digitally recorded interviews, could be easily shared and incorporated into a broader digital infrastructure telling a digital story of the mostly analogue history. However, in this context, the digital can be tied into this broader history of technological change and the attendant labour processes through which cinema reaches its audience. Some of the figures involved in film programming that we interviewed, including Ian Francis of the Flatpack Film Festival in Birmingham and Mark Cosgrove of the Watershed in Bristol, have noted that the freedom facilitated by digital distribution and exhibition returns the industry to what they've described as a kind of Wild West, which is very much like the earliest days of cinema history, free from the standards of institutionalisation and kind of standardisation. Digital projection is thus both a new frontier and an old one, and it places the projectionist back into view. In some ways, there are more projectionists than ever. They're just not working in the projection boxes in cinemas. And our work helps us to think about what the future history of cinema projection might look like, and what the values of cinema might be by looking back to what it once was and has been.